Right, this then is the third discussion review by Ben on the world of UFOs, or UAPs as they're trying to rename them.
Yeah.
So in this one, Ben, I believe you're going to take us from the beginning of the 1900s
Yeah.
onwards.
Yeah.
So take it away.
So obviously the first story that is quite well documented in a very famous event was the Tunguska event in 1908, and basically what happened there was well, quite incredible. So Russia is a vast country, as you know. There's a area of Russia by the name of Tunguska, and what happened was there was some sort of explosion that was an air blast, and that makes it a big difference, because when an explosive happens at ground level, it basically is absorbed by the ground and you might get a small crater. An air blast, what that does when it explodes, it will level whole forests, and in fact that's exactly what happened in Tunguska. Some sort of vehicle, craft, stroke, some people have said meteor, they don't know what the hell it were, but it literally exploded mid-air, approximate distance of 500 feet off the floor, and it leveled an entire forest. And this was discovered by explorers who were actually going out to look at the forest for cutting down trees. And when they actually got there, the job had already been done for them. Basically, trees were flattened for quite a few square miles. And there's only a couple of things in the world that can potentially do that. Yeah, there's only natural nuclear fission areas, and one of which is in Ethiopia. So, but as far as aware, none have been discovered in Russia. So it couldn't have been anything like that. And the way these trees were all laid out, it was centralized explosion. So basically, it was radiating outwards. So all the trunks were laid down flat. So imagine an explosion here, and then what you had was basically trees going out in like a clockwork, going all the way around, and then in the centre was nothing. So basically, people were asking questions. Scientists that have gone down there at the time were like, "How is this possible? How has this happened?"
Yeah.
You know. And to this day, there's been a lot of speculation that it could have been a meteor, an asteroid, or things like that. But what's interesting is if it was a meteor, what happens in a meteor explosion, and this has been validated in science, when there's been three major impact craters. One is in the Arizona desert, which is a very famous one. One is the one supposedly have killed off the dinosaurs in the Gulf of Mexico. And also, there is one that is credited potentially in the Younger Dryas period, creating the well-documented flood at the time, which was about 13,500 years ago. And in all of these cases, they're all linked to something called chondrules. And what chondrules are basically balls of metal from the asteroid or the meteor that have basically exploded off it. So you can imagine one of these things coming into land, it lands on the ground, lots of explosion, like a little volcanic explosion. You get orange sparks coming off it, and these orange sparks are liquefied metal. They land on the floor, get super cooled, and they create these spheres, and these are what are called chondrules. Well, at the Tunguska event, no chondrules have ever been discovered, ever. So that's something that in itself poses a question. How could it be a meteorite if no chondrules have been discovered? You know, because at every single documented meteor event, there's always been chondrules. You know, this has not only happened with all these big meteors events that I've talked about, but if you go to ice cores that have been taken from the North Pole, there's chondrules in the ice cores. Also, if you go to places like parts of the US where the ground is actually being put on show, and you can actually see millions of years of sediment, and there's one particular layer which is a dark black layer, and this can be discovered all around the world, And again, chondrules are in this area, and it dates back to around about 13,500 years ago. So basically, the Tunguska event is an enigma. What caused this event? And to this day, modern times, nobody knows what it is.
Did they identify an epicenter where there may have been, I don't know if there was, may have been an explosion or a point of impact?
No impact.
There was nothing physically.
Nothing physical. No, it was no impact crater. All there was an air blast, a patch of ground they estimated around about 100 meters in radius. No impact crater, and all the trees were just basically like the spokes of a wheel.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, come out in as miles as can go.
Yeah.
And the only thing that can create that is an air blast. And air blasts are well known to do huge amounts of damage. In fact, in the Second World War, one of the things that actually saved us was an invention coexistence between US and the UK, the proximity fuse. And that was devised by aircraft flying over during the Second World War, and because Great Britain and the US weren't war ready at this point, it took 1,800 rounds of anti-aircraft to shoot down one aircraft. So what the British did was they turned around to the Americans, and they originally said, have you got any batteries from hearing aids? And they went, okay, what are you doing? Why do you want so many? So they shared the details, and it got parked for a few years, and then it came back. And basically what happened was they used Christmas lights instead of hearing aid batteries to create a fuse. And basically it had gone from 1,800 rounds to now being able to literally, they shot down 4 practice aircraft in the space of 4 shots when they were trialing it. So why is that going to Tunguska? Well, basically what was happening was these proximity fuses had their own built-in little radar. So when it got to an aircraft, it would use explosive power to knock the aircraft out of the sky. Well, the Tunguska event exactly did the same thing with the trees. Same principle applied. Yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I never knew that.
Yeah. So it's quite an interesting one. Even to this day, people are still studying it, and there's a lot of controversy over it because, if you look on the main listing at the moment in regards to what went on there, the vast majority of scientists have gone, oh yeah, it was a meteor. Or we've proven that we found chondrules. Well, no, they haven't found chondrules. They said they had, but it turns out they weren't. So what was it? What they did find? And that's something that the scientists of today won't tell us. They won't say what it is. Oh yeah, it's chondrules. Well, how can it be?
Another question. At the time, was there the presence of any radiation found? If they could do radiation readings at the time?
At the time, they couldn't do Geiger counters. At the time, weren't invented.
Yeah, because that was 1908. Yeah, 208.
Yeah. So, however, recent studies have shown that there has been an increase in background radiation within the area. So, people think that radiation is once it's been leaked or in the area, that it'll be cleaned up. Well, depending on what type of radiation it is, it can stick around for thousands of years. Yeah. I mean, a perfect example of that is what happened in Ukraine in the Chernobyl. Yeah. They reckon that it's not going to be safe to live in the area for 20,000 years. However, weirdly, there is actually nature coming back to it, and there's a lady that actually lives in Ukraine, slap bang in the middle of the epicenter. And she's not been harmed at all by the radiation. So, it's a bit of a strange one. That's down to biology, but we won't direct off what we're talking about. But yeah, basically, they did find that the background radiation was slightly elevated compared to normal.
It was. Interesting. And then moving on, so one of my favourites is the 1940s and the Foo Fighters. Yes, it's
actually quite an interesting one of mine as well. That so obviously everybody knows Foo Fighters is a rock band named after them, with Dave Grohl as a drummer. But the Foo Fighters were actually an incident that took place not only during the First World War but also during the Second. Okay,
so the First World War as well.
The First World War as well. Ah. Yeah. So there was orange orbs that were following pilots in the First World War, but they sort of typical sort of time period at the time were just whatever and completely ignoring it. They didn't put anything to it. They just thought it was natural phenomena, but it has been documented. And then the more famous case is obviously in the Second World War. So what was happening was Great Britain, the Allies, were flying over to Germany, and were getting followed by these orbs, and they were almost crashing into the aircraft. And they thought it was a secret weapon of the Germans. Well, as the Germans were then flying over to Great Britain, they saw the same thing, and the same thing started happening to them, and they actually thought there was a secret weapon of the Allies. Well, it turns out and transpires that there was a meeting that took place, a truce at the time, between Germany and the Allies.
Good grief! This is during the war.
During the war, there was a secret truce that took place for a couple of days, whilst the Germans had a conversation with the Yanks and the Brits obviously had a conversation with the Germans, the high-end officers, saying, well, it ain't us, and the Germans going, well, it ain't us neither. So there was a conversation that was had, and again, this is documented, basically going, well, if it ain't you and it ain't us, again, what the hell is it? And this was on throughout the war, basically orange lights that were flying, over aircraft, over landing areas, over bombing areas. In fact, there is reason to believe that during the bombing raid of Berlin, where they did the firestorm, that prior to the actual event, food fighters were following the bombers. So again, why? What were they? Also, what happened as well, not just the food fighters, in 1939 in Italy, there was actually a UFO crash in the Italian mountains.
Yes.
So UFOs were actually being documented as early as the start of the Second World War, and then obviously we had the very, very famous case, what has been dubbed the Battle of Los Angeles, and that was a very, very famous case. In fact, one person died during that case, where it was just shortly after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. The Americans obviously were on high alert because of this incident taking place. At the time, the American president thought that if an invasion was to happen, it would come from the coast of California. So basically, what they had at the time was air raid sirens up and down the Californian coast, and they had anti-aircraft there. And on one particular day, they found this vehicle over the top of LA, and there's actually a very famous picture of all the lights shining on it, and it looks atypical UFO with a dome.
That's a famous photograph.
Photograph, yeah.
With all the searchlights.
All the searchlights on it.
Yeah.
And basically, thousands and thousands, no hyperbole, there was thousands of rounds of...
it was heavy artillery.
Massive heavy artillery.
And the report, it was going on for several hours.
Several hours, that's right. Thousands and thousands of rounds. In fact, a gentleman came out, saw what had happened, dropped dead of a heart attack.
Good grief.
That's the only death that was reported. Now, what was quite interesting is what a lot of people don't realise is not only was it over LA, but it actually went further down the coast where the same thing happened. So it wasn't just in LA that actually this thing was fired upon. It also got a few shots fired at it from San Diego as well.
Yeah. So that was 1942.
It was,
that
yes.
Incident occurred.
Yeah.
And then that leads us on to the really world famous event, the paradigm shift, I suppose, which was 1947, the Roswell incident.
The Roswell incident, yeah, 1947. This is basically one of the most world famous cases that has essentially brought forward a modern day UFO era. And what a lot of people don't realise is though, is that UFO crash of Roswell, there was actually two crashes. One was in Roswell, and one was further down, I think it's about 100 miles away. And it was reported that two UFOs crashed into each other and was brought down by the then American radar that we were using. Now remember, it was shortly after the war, it was in 1947. These UFOs were spotted for days and end over the I think it was the 967th bomb wing. I think it was 967. I don't know the exact number, but it was the bomb wing at the time. That was it was the only bomb wing in the world that had the nuclear bomb. So basically, these U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force, personnel were the creme de la creme. These guys and girls were, in control of the only nuclear power at the time. Yeah. So lots of reports at the time of UFOs, like sort of June, July time, and then basically on this one evening in 1947, a rancher had come out and actually gone to look for some of his cattle, and came across basically what can only be described in modern day in terms as memory metal. He picked it up, he squeezed it, and he said as he squeezed it and let it and back open again, it would return back to its normal shape with no creases in it. And basically to this day, we've now got that technology. Now, question, where did that technology come from? Well, it's rumoured that a lot of the technology we use today actually stemmed from Roswell. Whether that's true or not is a time for another day and another conversation. But if you look at the time period at the time, there was a massive jump in technology from the 1940s onwards.
Quantum leap.
Quantum leap. We've gone from using radio tubes to now microchips. We've gone. We were using. We're now using as well microfibers as well. Where did all this come from? Where did this quantum leap jump from?
Mobile phone technology,
absolutely,
push screens,
all that sort of stuff. Where did it all come from? What happened then was obviously we had the famous I think it was a major at the time, Jesse, first name Jesse. Famously collected up some of these pieces of the Roswell incident, and what happened was he was reportedly told by his superiors to go and take it to Andrews Air Force Base, except he didn't. What he did was he bypassed and went and took it to his family for a little bit and showed his family, and this was actually documented in his diaries. And his son to this day and his daughter have been on the Discovery Channel, they've been on History Channel, they've been on National Geographic, they've been on all sorts of documentary making programs, and his son will tell you the story of him remembering seeing these what can only be described as fiberglass beams with strange symbols on them, and what could only be described as a different language. He said he knows Russian writing. It wasn't Russian. Whatever these symbols were, it certainly wasn't anything that at the time was around that he recognised. And also on top of that, he was saying that this metal, they tried to rip it, wouldn't rip it, tried to burn it, wouldn't burn, they tried to cut it, wouldn't cut. So basically they even tried to get a saw on it and used a saw, and it wouldn't cut with a saw. So what was this metal? And it wasn't like small sheets of the stuff. We're talking, the size as A4, if not a little bit bigger. So his son was saying, he said basically it fascinated me, and he let me play with it for a few hours before he actually took it away to Andrews Air Force Base. Also, what was quite interesting during that time as well, it's rumoured that bodies were found. Why it was rumoured is that
Ben, just to interject that.
Yep.
The initial report, if we just focus on the initial reports, were that it was a UFO and bodies recovered.
Yeah.
That changed later. So take it from that. Were the initial report?
The initial report basically, it hid that potential bodies were found, and then it was rewritten, the report. In fact, what was famous was that the newspaper at the time released to the world, that we have one of these flying discs that were found.
Yeah.
And then 24 hours later, the military issued orders to the paper, who then rescinded and did another story. And that's where the controversy now lies.
The weather balloon.
The weather balloon. Now, what's quite interesting is if you just park the event itself to one side, over the years, accumulating up to modern day times, as recent as I think it was like 2 years ago. The changes of the story from the US Air Force and the Pentagon. Firstly, it was dummies that were being dropped by Russians. Then it was a balloon Project Mogul, listening to nuclear explosions. Then it was, genetically modified children from the Russians. Then it was experimental aircraft. There's been all sorts of things that the US Air Force have come out and said. That in itself poses a question. Why are they changing the story every 30 minutes, as it were? So
that was several different narratives.
Yeah.
Some of which were contradicting one another.
Yeah.
Which brings us right up to date, which is we've just had the same type of narratives being put to us by the government, the authorities in the USA.
We'll go back to that in a moment.
But later on.
To just focus a little bit more on the Roswell incident. So, one of the things that a lot of people don't know about the Roswell incident was that in improving technology of today's technology, what we've got now is obviously AI, and fairly recently, I think it was like last year, if not the year before, what they did was there is a very, very, very famous picture that went worldwide of Jesse and his general holding silver, silver foil, and they were saying it was a weather balloon.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, what they've done is they've actually ran the letter that one of the generals was holding at the time and translated it through AI.
Perhaps hidden in plain sight here, well, the memo is telling the true story.
Using modern digital enhancement techniques, it's possible to make out some of the words in Ramey's hand. Two in particular stand out: victims and disc.
Clearly, none of that applies to just the crash of a weather balloon.
We're talking about the admission that there are bodies. If that is correct, it's a smoking gun.
This information has been released on the History Channel. It was an Australian chap.
Ross Coulthard.
No, it wasn't Ross Coulthard. No, it was a guy who's he was ex-CIA and an Australian reporter, and they went and actually interviewed the family of Jesse Marcel. That was his name. Jesse Marcel's family. In fact, his son is also called Jesse Jr. And basically, they got the diary of Jesse. They got the photograph, and they ran it all through AI. And basically, AI have found that this is what it said. Now, it wasn't conclusive. There were gaps in the information because it was quite difficult to read because obviously degradation over time of the photograph. But what AI has done is basically pinned certain words together, and that's what it's revealed, that this wreckage was taken to Andrews Air Force Base. So this is, again, something that's quite new information. So it's such a interesting subject area because even to this day, still things are being discovered. Like back in the 90s, everybody thought that there was just one incident. Well, it then came to light that actually this crash happened because the army were using, radio frequencies that apparently, supposedly, interfered with their navigational systems. And to this day, it's rumoured that current UFO bring downs are being used through the same principles and technology of EMP and radio frequency.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very interesting subject matter because a whole narrative has been built up around it now. So if you go to Roswell itself, and it is actually a town, the town of Roswell, you can go there. Their whole sort of financial income is based on this story,
Okay.
So which in itself poses questions. Is that the right way to manage this? There is a lot of history behind it. There is a lot of questions still to be asked about it. As to, for example, one question is, where did the crash retrieval come from? At the time, the CIA was in its infancy. You know, so that quite clearly the CIA. So the CIA at the time was fairly new, and basically, how is it a crash retrieval unit appeared on the scene so quickly? You know, and why is it they were told not to reveal this to the public? Other questions include, you know, where did the crash retrieval go after Andrews Air Force Base? Because what was quite interesting was there was a gentleman who owned a burial business. Well, he got an order for 3 children's boxes, which were then taken to the Roswell crash area, rumouredly, and then whistleblowers have come forward in the last 5-10 years whereby they've said they've witnessed that these 3 bodies were actually taken to Andrews Air Force Base, as well as taken to the local hospital. And basically a doctor has come forward from the time period saying that he had to do an autopsy on bodies that appeared grey in nature with big eyes, and also on top of that he said he'd never come across anything like it, and that their organs were not anything like human species. He couldn't tell them anything. He didn't know what he was looking at, and this has again been documented on quite a lot of documentaries, from the History Channel to you know, National Geographic and places like that. In fact, fairly recently, as last year, they did a very good documentary on National Geographic talking about these whistleblowers. It's also rumoured to say that, whether this is true or not, I'm still a little bit on the fence with. It's rumoured that the local hospital in Roswell does actually have a ghost of the alien, supposedly. Whether again that's true is, again, could it be going towards that feeding of the financial sort of income of the town? You know, I'm a little bit 50-50 on that, because I've not seen any evidence to the contrary or any evidence to support it. I'm still a little bit, okay, that one I'm going to take with a pinch of salt. But with the rest of the information that I've disclosed, it's very well documented that all this information is out there, that there's been quite a lot of whistleblowers coming forward saying this is actually what happened on the night.
Yeah, that was certainly a big event.
It was.
And then leading on from that, the next biggie, I think, was 1952, was the Washington DC incident.
Yeah, Washington DC incident was an interesting one. So again, government cover-up. We'll talk about that initially. They've said it was birds, and they've said basically that it was spotlights shining on birds. Okay, well, there's one problem with that. Birds don't sit still in one area for a couple of hours, nor are these big nor are they quite big and large, as wide as a 300-meter radius. You know, I've never come across a bird that big before. You know, and what happened was, for several days, I think it was well over a week, every night, basically these huge, ginormous white circles would appear over the Capitol building, on the dome. And again, there's very well documented photographs that have taken place, photographic evidence of this. Now, okay, it's black and white, grainy, but it shows, you know, 4 or 5 of these big white ginormous orbs around the rotunda of the Capitol building.
Yeah,
you know,
it's quite a famous photo.
A very famous photo, yeah. And it was witnessed by thousands of people, and that's what adds credence to this. You know, the credence being that, okay, one person seen an event take place. Okay, if you've got no evidence, it's controversial, because you're thinking, well, you know, where do we go with this? There's only one person, no information. Okay, 2 people, well, they can corroborate the story. You know, 3 people and evidence. Now we're getting a little bit more credence to it. But when it's a mass sighting like this, and it's photographed, and it was in the news, and it was actually on the radio, and people saying, you know, yeah, don't shoot at them, you know, because we don't know what they are, and people were actually shooting at these things, and basically it frightened a lot of people at the time, and yeah, it was an estimated 10,000-15,000 people at the time saw these events every single night for several days.
Yeah, as you say, mass sighting, and no doubt at the time the government would have tried to laugh it also as or describe it as
Yeah.
mass hysteria.
Yeah, mass hysteria,
Yeah.
swamp gas, planet Venus.
Swamp gas was another one.
Yeah,
Yes.
Project Blue Book. That's a very famous project, very much like what we have got in modern day today, like ATIP and Arrow. Project Blue Book was the supposed. I think there was actually an investigation before Project Blue Book. I can't remember the name of that one, but Project Blue Book is a very famous case with Alan Hynek. What was quite interesting is there was actually a film which is Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Steven Spielberg. Well, there was a gentleman who plays, who's a French gentleman. Alan Hynek actually gave a little bit of direction to Steven Spielberg about his things. Now, originally when Alan Hynek did Project Blue Book, he was a complete debunker. Did not believe in UFOs one bit. In fact, some would argue his bias was a perfect choice of the reason as to why the American government chose him in the first place. Yeah. Having ran Project Blue Book through its eternity, by the time he finished and the American government went, yeah, nothing to see here, Alan Hynek had completely done a 180, being from a complete skeptic, not believing, to being one of the world leading researchers in UFOs. The 1950s incident was put down to birds, it was put down to the planet Venus. So yeah, at the time, people believed a lot of what the American government was saying, because at the time, their view was, well, why should the government lie? Recently, as you know, people now don't believe the governments of the world and do question everything, especially in light of everything that's come out over the years about the lies that they've told. So that being one case in point.
And then leading on from that, there was the fascinating one that I didn't know about. I only discovered this morning actually. There was the 1954 Fiorentina Stadium in Italy.
Yeah, so that was quite an interesting one in that Italy, like Great Britain and the rest of Europe, famous for its football. For those of you who are watching in the US, if you do watch in the US, you would call it soccer. The real name is football. And basically what had happened was a couple of thousand people watching a football game, and then all of a sudden 3 vehicles appeared over the stadium, which then stopped the game in its tracks. Players, people in the stadium watching, these vehicles hover over the stadium in complete and utter silence. Now, who knew that potential UFO pilots were fans of football? But that's not been the first incident of UFOs hovering over sports events. There's been events where they've hovered over baseball games in the US. There's been events where they've hovered over horse racing events or camel racing events rather in Dubai. There's been events where flying events, like there was one famous case of an air race, around the world air race, being followed by UFOs. So that UFOs are well known for being around sports events. Why that is still yet to be discovered.
Part of their research.
Possibly,
look at these strange human beings, 90,000 people,
or watching a
ball being kicked around.
Exactly. So I put a bit of humour towards that incident because it is quite amusing in the respect that you can just watch sort of these pilots watching the game, but it put the seriousness back into the subject matter. I'm not being humorous to dismiss it, and it is quite an interesting one because there's been quite a lot of other cases of mass events where, again, there was a famous one in the 1800s, basically, of being in Portugal. In fact, that went as far as going to the Vatican and the Pope. And basically there was a mass event there of 10,000, 15,000 people seeing this event, bright light orb in the sky, and basically that was quite an interesting one that I want to deviate, but yeah, the Fiorentina event was quite an interesting one in the fact that it lingered there for a couple of hours, You know,
Is it a few hours? Not over the stadium in
the area, yeah, in the area. It was
yeah.
a few hours in the area. Over the stadium, I think it was there for a few minutes, like 20, 30 minutes or so. But I mean, sort of that, it's kind of an interesting paradox in the respect of, you know, 1 minute you're watching a football game and now you're watching 3 aircraft that don't have any wings hovering over a stadium. You know, so yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one.
The report that I found there on that, there were 10,000 people in the stadium who actually saw it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So 10,000 people. Again, it goes back to the Washington event. 15,000 people were seeing that.
That's nice.
There's a mass sighting. It's a lot of people with a lot of evidence.
And then, so that's moving on from the football side of things.
Yeah.
And then bringing it more up to date. The big one was 1980, Rendlesham Forest.
Great Britain's Roswell, as you call it. Yeah. So Rendlesham Forest was again trying to be debunked by both the British and the US. Now, I'm ex-military. I served myself in the Royal Air Force, and back then in the 80s, I tell you this because I do know a little bit about the procedures and policies. So US have aircraft here in the UK, okay, and basically they rent the land from us, okay. Now, what happened is during this event was over Christmas period, basically leading up to Christmas, lights have been found in the forest. At the time, they were keeping an eye on it, and basically at the time the base commander, he wasn't aware of it because it was the base manager and supervisor who was handling it. But then what happened was during his Christmas meal on Boxing Day, he obviously, the base commander actually knew about it, and he was kept informed by his base supervisor. And famously, the base supervisor turned up at his Christmas dinner in the mess hall and whispered, "Sir, it's back." Now, the reason why it wasn't sort of the base commander dealt with it for a while was because, going back to the policies, is that because we rent the US rent the land basically, and the British also have a base fairly nearby. Well, the US were like, well, it's a British responsibility, but then the British were going, well, it's an American base, so it's American responsibility. So there was like an almost in-house argument going on at the time of whose responsibility it was to actually monitor this incident. And again, that is well documented. In fact, a memorandum was actually sent, and that this is courtesy of Nick Hope, who's a well-known MOD, ex-MOD employee and now UFO researcher. He's actually got a copy of this memorandum actually saying, look, it's not our responsibility, the argument that was going on. So going back to the Christmas dinner, basically the base commander then famously went, "What's back?" And his base supervisor turned around and went, "The lights are back." At which point he got up and went, "Right, yeah, all right, whatever, this is ridiculous." And he got his jacket on to go and debunk what he thought, at the time was lights, was a lighthouse, supposedly, and that has been said, it was supposedly the lighthouse. In fact, it was also debunked in regards to them turning around and saying apparently it was the SAS playing a prank on them because the Americans had been on exercise with them that particular week. And they were boasting about how they wouldn't be able to get on their base because it was a supposedly, I say supposedly, I don't know whether it is because there's no evidence to the contrary, but there was talk apparently of nuclear missiles being on the base. Now, what's kind of interesting is there's always been a connection between nuclear material and UFOs, and that's been going on since the 1940s. So basically he got his jacket on, walked outside, went to the forest, only to be confronted with what he saw. And he's a very famous tape recording of it.
For UFO researchers, the halt tape, never before heard on national television, represents undeniable proof not only that UFOs exist, that one had actually landed in Rendlesham Forest.
Okay, we're now approaching area, what looks like a blasted or scrubbed up area here.
Bees.
There's a round of site, all after the bridge and facing in the same direction towards the center.
The team also uses a Geiger counter to check the clearing for radioactivity.
We get a high reading. What is that? We are getting an indication of a heat source coming out of that center spot. Looks like heat or some form of energy.
The taped evidence indicates Halt and his men are witnessing a highly unusual aerial object moving through the forest. The investigators hurry to get a better view. But when they step into a second clearing, yet another UFO suddenly appears in the sky directly above them. This one sends a beam of light down to the ground just in front of them.
Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal.
Which people can go and watch and listen to, and he describes what he sees, which is red lights coming to him, red lights sinking into the ground. There was yellow mist on the floor and over the lake, disappearing into the ground. And it later transpired that during the time period that basically one of the sergeants at the time, he was a gate sergeant, him and his mate touched one of these vehicles that had actually landed, and it left physical evidence with imprints on the ground, which they actually took plaster casts of. There was basically radiation was through the roof at the time on the Geiger counters, because they actually had a Geiger counter with them. And basically when they touched it in 2018, a diary was discovered by a family member of the gentleman who touched it. And what had happened was, it transpired that after him touching it, yes, he got burns and a little bit of radiation sickness, but he'd been having strange dreams. And he'd been writing these dreams down, what he was seeing, in a little notebook. And these dreams consisted of ones and zeros. Now, straight away, anybody who knows computers, quite clearly, everybody knows it's code, you know. So basically, he wrote it all down, completely forgot he'd done this in the diary, put it in storage, thought nothing of it. 30 years later, family member was tidying up, discovered it, and she turned around and said, "What's this, Dad?" "Oh yeah, that was when I was documenting what my dreams I had after the Rendlesham Forest incident." What's these ones and zeros? Oh, that's what I was seeing in my dreams, and I still occasionally see them now. And anyway, her daughter's husband turned around and went, "That looks like computer code. Let's go and take it to a friend of mine." And he was a computer scientist. So anyway, what happened was then it was later released that this computer scientist had actually pulled it apart, ran it through computer programs, and it transpired it was a message. And it was coordinates to an island as well of the country of Ireland that is supposedly now sank into the North Atlantic. Also, they were saying that basically it was a message about warning us about false gifts and taking false gifts from other visitors, aka grey visitors, and that basically it was being sent supposedly from the future, because we're talking about a conduit being open and then a conduit being closed, and it dated 8,848 years apparently. That's what it's been documented on, and it's been talked about again on well-known documentaries on, you know, the History Channel and Netflix and all that. There's been a lot of information about the Rendlesham incident. Nick Pope, he's done multiple lectures on the subject matter. Nick Pope has actually interviewed multiple individuals that were there, that have all come out and sort of corroborated the story. Also they've interviewed the base commander, they've interviewed the base supervisor, gate guards, they've interviewed British and American, and they've also interviewed British people who lived around the forest as well, who had also seen these lights over the last few days. Also, there's a memorandum that's come out of the MOD with it being documented, and going very high up the chain, not just the MOD, but even further up to Whitehall and the Prime Minister at the time, and also the military and the person in charge of the military at the time as well. So both US and UK eyes only. So it was also went to the president as well in the US. So this thing rattled a few cages. So yeah, basically the incident at Roswell is again the British. They call it the British Roswell, but there's another interesting one. Just very briefly, the Welsh incident. I can't pronounce this. So
Yes.
Basically, you know, there was a UFO that supposedly landed in the forest in that area.
Yeah.
And that was a very well-known case as well. Again, that's been interviewed by a lady who has been doing a lot of research on that. She wasn't even a UFO researcher. The Welsh papers tried to cover it up, as did the Welsh government.
And suspicions were aroused when the helicopters arrived, military helicopters arrived.
There was a NATO aircraft on scene as well. Her hair turned white when she went to the area. It was snowing in one area in particular, but not everywhere else. There was military personnel acting very strangely around the area with computers and tents and things like that staying on scene. So yeah, there's been quite a lot of...
That was another major one.
There's been quite a few major ones in the UK. Scottish incident as well with walkers. Also Scottish incident where a gamekeeper got dragged into a UFO. A police gentleman, a police officer in Yorkshire, in sort of border between Halifax and Rochdale, UFO landed in the middle of the road, and he had missing time, and that was well documented as well. So there's been quite a lot of UFOs in Great Britain.
A lot there, yeah, definitely. Big incidents. And then just to wrap it up at this stage,
yep,
we can't let this one go. Back to 1997, the Phoenix Lights incident, which has got a fascinating story behind it, featuring Kurt Russell, the Hollywood actor.
Hollywood actor, yeah.
At one stage, yeah.
So basically, the Phoenix Lights was a really interesting case for a number of reasons. One was the fact that how many people actually saw this. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just one city in Phoenix, Arizona. It actually flew over pretty much the entire state of Arizona.
Yeah. This
was not like a couple of thousand. This is like a couple of million people who saw this event take over sort of over the couple of days. And basically, it flew over one person's house at such a low altitude.
Yeah.
Thank you. Low altitude that basically he said it blocked out the stars, and that it was like he looked up and all he could see was like essentially like looking up at a swimming pool, like wavy kind of air almost. Yeah. That was before the day of the famous Phoenix Light incident, and basically what happened during the Phoenix Light day, the event itself, was there was a very famous film and photographs taken from multiple angles of 9 lights appearing in the sky in a triangular formation at low level, estimated between 300 to 500 feet. Basically, again, military personnel try to cover it up by turning around and saying, oh yes, it's flares. Well, it's interesting you should say that, because there's been a recent podcast. Again, I can find the link and potentially find it and put it in these podcasts and data in the bottom of the video if necessary, for other people to go and look up on this itself. But this one particular podcast, it's well known for documenting physics and astronomy and, you know, all the weird and wonderful things that are in that area, like quantum mechanics and stuff like that. And one of the things he touches on is this Phoenix Lights incident. And what he did was he hired a private pilot. They took off at night, roughly at the same time of evening, and every 5 seconds they dropped flares, because the American military said apparently at the time it was A-10 Warthogs dropping flares during an exercise. Well, that's kind of interesting, because a couple of months later they didn't say it was A-10 Warthogs, they then said it was F-16s. Then F-16s turned into F-18s, and then F-18s turned into F-15s. So there's been an inconsistency of information being released from the US Air Force themselves. Going back to what this podcast person did, they dropped flares, and basically what the flares did was they only lasted in the air for a couple of minutes, and they were even out of sync. So even though they were dropped every 5 seconds, They were being blown all over the sky.
They didn't maintain the linear formation.
Formation. So the Phoenix lights were formation, orange light in a triangular formation.
Yeah.
Okay. These flares, well, one was at this height, one was at this height, one was at that height, one was at this height, one was at that height, and they were all being blown. So there was just no consistency at all.
Yeah.
The other thing that
the duration that those flares lasted on the test.
That I was about to say that. Yeah. The other thing was that the duration of these were about 3-4 minutes, 5 at the very most, where they were illuminated. Well, these Phoenix lights were there for hours.
Yes. Yeah.
Hours. You know. And with regards to Kurt Russell, what happened was, and this was documented on the BBC One show very famously.
That's where I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah. And basically, he was being interviewed, and they'd had somebody on talking about the weird and wonderful. And he turned around and went, well, I've actually got a confession to make. I actually was part of a very famous incident called the Phoenix Lights. And he goes on to tell them how he was flying his son into Phoenix, Arizona for an event, and he actually flew over the top of them. And basically it turned out that the investigators at the time were looking for a light aircraft that flew over the top of this vehicle. And for a number of years he didn't come forward because of ridicule. He thought he'd get blackballed in Hollywood.
And I think it was Sky Harbor, and there's these bank of lights, 6 lights, in the shape of a triangle going back right over the airport. And I'm looking at them as I'm coming in. I'm on the horn talking to them, and I'm coming in, and I'm not saying anything about it because I'm kind of confused by it, but I can't tell if this is going to be an issue or not with landing. And Oliver said, hey, Pa, what are those lights? And I said, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what they are. And so anyway, I called up the tower and I said, what are you guys painting tonight over the airport? And they said, we're not showing anything. What are you seeing? I said, well, there's 6 lights in a row. And they said, do you want to report this? And I said, look, I can't identify it. It's flying.
But it turns out he wasn't the only Hollywood actor that actually saw these events. And when the other Hollywood actor, I can't remember who it was at the time, came forward, he went, I'm going to admit now that it was me. And basically he talked about all this.
And he would have the logbook entry.
He's got the logbook entry, again,
him.
another witness logbook, documented flight patterns. A lot of people may not be aware of this, that when any aircraft around the world, whether it's in the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, anywhere, every single aircraft has to log a flight plan with that country's aviation authority. Yeah. So for the US, it's the FAA. For here in the UK, we have the Aviation Authority. In the America, it stands for Federal Aviation Authority. And basically, even light aircraft have to log what their flight path is going to be. Well, there you go. Investigators went back to the FAA, went, can we just validate this? And sure enough, there it was. So, it was a very famous case. Obviously, it was very famous as well for negative reasons.
The mayor,
just about to come on to that, famously dressed and got one of his staffers to dress up as an alien. Well, what happened was he got absolutely slaughtered. In fact,
because hundreds of thousands of people had seen it across Arizona and different states.
A couple of million, it wasn't hundreds of thousands. It went through the whole state essentially over a couple of days. Now, what was quite interesting was this mayor. It's rumoured to say that he potentially could have lost the election because of it.
Yes.
However, it came out again on the History Channel as an exclusive that they did an actual documentary on this subject, and basically he confessed that he himself saw the event himself, and he'd been told by members of government and members of the military to cover it up. That he was told not to talk about it, to play it down. His words, not mine. I'm directly quoting that, and saying basically, we were told to cover it down, and basically don't make anything of it. Needless to say, again, there's that kind of cover-up element. He's now come out and basically been an advocate for free speech and being open and talking about UFOs in general. Also, there's a very famous case of a female reporter, taking photographs of the event as well from another angle. a lot of the photographs that were taken were from at city level, and basically from the hills. Well, she lives offset of the hills, and she's got some great footage of these lights in static formation with the 9 triangular lights. So yeah, it was a very interesting case, that one. But I mean, over the modern day, very briefly, just before I finish, I mean, even now, UFOs, there's been a lot of stuff going on in Philadelphia and Washington with these drones and things like that. There's a lot of controversy about what the American government have come out with recently, and talked about how it was essentially experimentation. Well, very briefly there, basically, explain why it is that some of these other homemade drones have been sent up, and then the batteries being drained in seconds and being melted, the electronics and things like that, and there's been like strange lights that were seen around this event, not just drones but orbs and things like that. So
shape changing,
yeah. So
if that was authentic footage that hadn't been played around with, if that's authentic, then that really can't be explained.
Yeah,
the shape shifting.
Exactly, and there's also been or supposedly drones being spotted out at sea as well by the Coast Guard, off the North Atlantic. So again, there's still a lot of, I wouldn't say cover up exactly, but a lot more is coming out at the moment, especially with Russ Coulthard and people like that.
Stephen Greer. The disclosures.
Disclosure project.
2025 is supposed to be the big year, the definitive year of disclosure.
I take that
with the whistleblowers coming out.
Yeah, I take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. They've been saying that for several years now, and we get what we like to call in the UFO community a lot of nothing burgers.
Yeah.
However, in saying that, the biggest story that took place was obviously the incident that took place in the North Pacific in 2004, and when the Washington Post wrote the story that broke the world, as it were, whereby these Tic Tac events were Tic Tac UFOs were being spotted during military exercises in the Pacific. Since that has broke, and the Pentagon have turned around and gone, yeah, that's real, and now Arrow and ATIP and these investigation units are now coming forward and basically talking about this. Basically, there's a lot less stigma attached to it, and a lot more people coming forward, well-known people who are well in Hollywood, as well as politicians, are coming forward saying what they've experienced. Fighter pilots, civilian pilots. I mean, even now, civilian pilots, up until last year, were not allowed to report it. They were told, do not report it, it'll ruin your career. Now, the aviation authorities are turning around and going, well, okay, when the military are reporting it, we might need to start documenting it. So we're now getting a lot of civilian craft basically report. I mean, there was an incident only last year in December, Manchester Airport. There was a UFO that actually hovered off the ground.
Oh, this was the orb.
The orb, Manchester Airport. And when they approached it, it shot up to about 400 foot up in the air at high speed. And this was caught on radar and also caught on film. So, again, documented evidence, radar especially.
I saw that on the footage, but then I read somewhere that it was photoshopped.
There was.
What do you know about that?
So there was a little bit of controversy in that it was highlighted for Photoshop and highlighted via AI. However, there has been film footage recently of it in the air that has come out. So yes, the one while it was on the ground has been photoshopped and has been run through
that's
through
the one
AI.
that got me excited.
Yeah, that's the one that runs through AI. However, there has been the film version of it. That one of the ground staff were actually filming. So it was there. But again, we've got to be careful with this AI side of things, because there is a lot of stuff out there. They call it deep fake, and there is, talk within the community of UFOs and UAPs that there are a lot of people that are basically, sending this stuff out there to muddy the waters and confuse things.
To obfuscate matters, as they say.
So that's bringing us up to the modern day.
So that's it. I think the one theme that we can pick out of that throughout the 1900s, in particular, especially from Roswell onwards, Rendlesham and the Phoenix Lights. Though, if you pick out those three key events, there's been a lot of officialdom, government bodies,
Yeah.
military,
Yeah.
who've been subjecting it to ridicule to a degree. Less so now,
Yeah.
but that was a theme, and raising doubts about it and trying to debunk these stories so they create their own narrative. And having said that, these authorities have moved more in the direction of being more open about it.
That's right.
But even then, we were told by Trump when he got into power, these drones around the New York area, we've got to find out what they are. We're going to tell everyone what they are.
Yeah.
And the recent explanation we've got, for me, doesn't add up.
No,
Which is they were approved by the FAA, approved to the degree that the FAA would have people flying drones around that would close down international airports.
Yeah, there is a lot of controversy. I mean, the fact that a lot of UFO researchers, George Knapp, Ross Coulthard, Nick Pope, they're all saying the same thing. That is hoodwink. It is red herring. There is quite clearly something else going on within the UFO community. We're not taking that as read. There is a lot of research being done by open, independent civilian individuals. In fact, there's a really good documentary maker called Tyler. A shout out to his. If you ever want to watch more UFO stories, it's called Secure Team 10, and it does a UFO podcast online on YouTube. If you want to go and give a shout out to him and have a little look at his stuff, he gets all these other people and basically is independent. And also Third Phase of Moon, that's another YouTube video maker, and they've done a lot of documentary work with Stephen Greer and people like that.
Yeah.
You know,
And so to round off here today, we've gone through in some detail there of the key events, I'd say, throughout the 1900s up to relative contemporary events. And I'd say certainly with the drones that there's a lot more to come yet.
there is a lot more to come on that.
So
yeah, I'd
watch
agree with that.
watch
Watch
this
this space. Yeah,
as they
absolutely,
say.
absolutely. But yeah, just to finally finish, obviously we're trying to push YouTube and beat the algorithm, and basically, unfortunately, YouTube has recently changed their protocols again, so it is making it more and more difficult for startup YouTube channels like ourselves to get out there. So if you'd like to like, subscribe and make comments, and also push that notification bell for any other videos going forward, that it'll let you know that we've actually dropped a video. This channel is going to be talking about a lot of other things other than what I've been talking about, and yeah, it's there for giving the older generation something new to look and watch and feel. So yeah.
So thanks for watching us, much appreciated.
Okay, thank you very much.